This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 519, entitled Masculist Divorce Court, Lawyers and Judges Taking Back the Divorce Courts. Description. This flyer advocates that a lot more masculists should become divorce court lawyers and judges, so that they give judgments that are fair to men. It provides concrete suggestions on how these masculist judges and lawyers can use their masculist principles to do this. For example, make custody of the kids joint by default, throw out alimony, scrap the halving of wealth and stuff, use a financial independence principle with fluffies, lecturing them to become FIPs or be rejected by society for being manslavers. Biconscious masculist judges will harangue their monoconscious feminist judges and convert them to biconsciousness, or receive very unpleasant treatment by these biconscious masculist judges for these women's monoconscious bigotry and abuse of divorcing fathers. Now the flyer itself. Masculist Lawyers and Judges Taking Back the Divorce Courts by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. The main difference between the Masculists and the MGTOWs is that the MGTOWs are passive and the Masculists are fighters. MGTOWs just quietly walk away from marriage and paternity, largely due to the toxicity of the divorce courts taken over by the hated fluffy feminists, who have made divorce so toxic for men that they have made marriage and paternity toxic for men. So now millions of young men have wiped their hands of marriage and particularly paternity, since they absolutely refuse to face 1 in 4 chance of being financially massacred and have their lives ruined in a hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce court system. So MGTOWs accept passively the feminist hegemony over culture, that is, the genocracy we all currently live in. Masculists, on the other hand, are fighters, aggressive, hateful, active, who look upon the apolitical passivity of the MGTOWs with contempt, seeing them as apolitical wimps. MGTOWs look upon what is happening to 1 father in 4 in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts and think, quote, "Fuck this, I'm not going to live in such a society. I'll go my own way, rejecting marriage, paternity, and I'll spend my money on myself. Fluffy, manslaving parasites can go fuck themselves, since I won't. I won't go near them, not even pumping and dumping them." End quote. Of course, in practice, masculists do much the same thing. That is, they refuse to have anything to do with fluffy, manslaving parasites, and even more so with fluffy feminists, who masculists see as even more hateable due to the awful hypocrisy of fluffy feminists, who want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men to share equally the burden of earning the living by bothering to get a career-competent education at high school and college. So these fluffy feminists act as feminists in the parliaments, but as fluffy manslavers in the divorce courts, so are spat on by both MGTOWs and masculists. So the MGTOWs merely walk away from the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts, leaving them intact, whereas the masculists fight them and aim to change them by largely taking them over, or at least putting a powerful masculist stamp on them, so that men, divorcing fathers, get a much better deal than they do today, where fluffy feminist lawyers and judges see divorcing fathers merely as cash machines to be abused and robbed. Masculists take a page out of Marx's view on the world, in the sense that Marx said famously, quote, "The philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." End quote. Masculists accept this view wholeheartedly and are out to change the gynocentric world we live in, where women still oppress men for decades of their lives, using characteristic masculist anger and hatred at the massive gender injustices committed by women against men, particularly in the divorce courts, the media, the schools, the laws, etc. This fire talks about how masculists aim to reform the divorce courts by having about half of the divorce court lawyers and judges be masculists, who see the world through masculist eyes and change the divorce rulings that they impose on divorcing fathers. How can this be done? If one looks at the divorce court lawyers and judges in the so-called family courts, they are run largely under the assumption of traditional gender roles. That is, the mother gets custody of the kids and the father has to pay. This traditional attitude, particularly among fluffy feminists who are angry at men for how men oppress women, as taught to them by monoconscious feminism, but who know nothing about masculism, so by default have traditional expectations of men, seeing men as cash machines to pay for women to have babies. Masculists are enraged by this attitude, arguing that women have a life expectancy of 85 years thanks to men, and a career window of half a century, so have a powerful moral obligation to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up by bothering to get career competent educations at high school and college, so that they are FIPs as adults, and not expect to parasite off the money and labour of a man slaving him for decades, and thus earning the burning hatred of the masculists, seeing her as a hateable manslaver to be spat at and severely punished by being forced to rot on the shelf, since masculisted men will not go near her, seeing her as vermin to be exterminated, which is what masculists do to her in practice, wiping her out, and thus wiping out fluffydom, the manslavery of men. So the first major step in masculisting the divorce courts is obviously to put masculists into these courts. So masculists who have a legal background, who have formal training in the law at university, take their masculist values with them into the divorce courts, where they are employed, and then change things. Masculist divorce court lawyers and judges are very aware, due to their masculist worldview, that one of the major reasons why millions of MGTOWs are MGTOW is because of their refusal to face a 1 chance in 4 of losing custody of their kids in a hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce court. So they simply reject paternity. And this is wiping out whole populations due to the birth rate crash caused by MGTOW men. The MGTOWs hate the fluffy feminists, as do the masculists, seeing them as indirect genociders, since they are the root cause of the crash in the birth rate. So one of the first priorities of a masculisted divorce court judge or lawyer is to give joint custody of the kids after a divorce to both parents by default, so that MGTOWs can no longer say that they have a 1 in 4 chance of losing their kids, which is one of the major reasons why MGTOWs and masculists have such a hatred of the fluffy feminists in the divorce courts who do this to men, committing a massive gender crime against men, which cannot continue, because if it does, then eventually masculist soldiers will simply shoot them and then force the divorce courts to be men-fared. Thus, the masculistic divorce court judge or lawyer is very conscious of this scenario and feels a powerful moral obligation to be fair to divorcing fathers and give them joint custody of these men's kids, so that men are more prepared to be fathers again. But in today's gynocentric world, men are still seen as cash machines, which makes young men wipe their hands of marriage and paternity. Masculistic divorce court lawyers and judges strongly disapprove of fluffies, seeing them as hateful manslavers, since they are masculists, and see fluffydom as manslavery, which they aim to wipe out by wiping out fluffies, by forcing them to rot on the shelf. In the context of a divorce court, a masculist judge will throw out alimony, seeing it as a gender crime against men, and lecture a fluffy divorcing wife that she has a powerful moral obligation to get off her fat parasitic ass and grow up to become a financially responsible adult, and not expect to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, thus making her a man-slaving vermin. Monoconscious feminists keep talking about the top priority of the needs of the children and ignore the needs and rights of the fathers. This makes sense in evolutionary terms, since women share half their genes with their kids, whereas they share no genes with their ex-husbands. So in about half of divorces, the ex-wife turns into a vindictive feminazi bitch, out to, quote, take him for all he's worth, end quote. That is, to extract the maximum amount of resources and money from him that she can, the utter parasitic, thieving bitch, which makes such women, such fluffies, so hated by the masculists, who aim to wipe them out as vermin by totally ignoring them, punishing them to death, a slow death, rotting on the shelf, utterly and totally rejected by men for being the decades-lasting man-slavers that they are. Monoconscious feminists, being women, place the interest of the kids way above the interest of the divorcing father and financially crucify him, forcing him to lose custody of his kids with a 90% probability, forcing him to pay for his kids he will barely be allowed to see, losing half of his wealth and stuff to his ex-wife so that she can continue to be a fluffy and raise her kids in his house. And if she's a real fluffy, he may be forced by the monoconscious feminazi judge to pay his ex-wife alimony for the rest of his life. This kind of massive gender injustice causes many divorcing fathers to murder their divorce court judges who ruin their lives. To masculists, this is a war issue, so the masculist divorce court judge can appeal to the self-preserving interest of monoconscious feminist judges to become biconscious in their own self-interest if they don't want to be murdered by masculist soldiers if a sex war comes that is increasingly talked about in the manosphere. So masculist divorce court judges can routinely give fathers joint custody of their kids, throw out alimony, scrap the halving of wealth and stuff between the ex-wife and the ex-husband, which is seen by the masculists as another major gender crime against men because it is so open to abuse by fluffies. In the extreme case, a divorcing wife of a male billionaire walks away with billions of dollars simply because earlier in her marriage she gave her cunt to her husband. To masculists, every woman has a cunt, and cunts are not that valuable. The fact that such a mass theft fluffy can walk away with a fortune is an example of the gender crimes that fluffies commit against men, and it's a law that needs to be scrapped because it is so unjust to men. Similar logic applies to ownership of the house. The person who paid for it gets to keep it. One of the basic principles used by a masculist judge is that of financial independence of the two divorcing parties, that is the ex-husband and the ex-wife. Masculists push women very hard to be FIPs or be severely punished, since a divorcing fluffy creates real problems in the divorce courts for men, for divorcing husbands. One of the major aims of the masculists is the creation of a FIP society, capital F, capital S, where both sexes, especially girls, are raised by parents and educated by teachers to be FIPs as adults, so that they do not expect to parasite off the labour and money of a man, so that they do not manslave him for decades and thus earn the hatred of the masculists, who soon will be most men, as masculist ideas continue to spread across the planet. Masculist divorce court lawyers and judges are in a position to harangue their monoconscious feminist lawyers and judges, teaching them masculist values and how those values impact on divorce and divorce judgments. It's likely that in the early years from now, there'll be a lot of verbal blood spilt within the divorce courts between biconscious male judges and lawyers and monoconscious female judges and lawyers. In time, these monoconscious feminazi judges and lawyers will be converted into being a lot more biconscious, since they will not like being harangued by very angry, hateful, masculist judges who will use their male intelligence and greatly superior aggressiveness, in brackets, given men's 10 times greater testosterone levels in their blood, close brackets, on these women, who will not be able to withstand the anger, hatred, and sheer logical and scientific force of these men's masculist arguments, since these women's former anger at men for the ways that men oppress women is much weaker than in the reverse direction, which is what masculists are in the process of making clear to society now. With masculists in the divorce courts as lawyers and judges, the divorce courts will lose their toxicity for men, for divorcing fathers, so that men are more prepared to be fathers again, since they will no longer face a 1 in 4 chance of being financially massacred, losing his kids, etc. in the current hated, monoconscious, fluffy feminist controlled divorce court system. These courts today scream out for reform. One of the best ways to implement that reform is to put masculists into positions of divorce court lawyers and judges, so that the divorces themselves are judged according to masculist principles. This is an example of men, of masculists, fighting for the men-faring of the gender laws, starting with the worst offender, that is, the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce court system, that is both hypocritical and genocidal. These courts have to be masculisted, or thousands of monoconscious, fluffy feminist divorce court judges and lawyers are going to be murdered. It is in their self-interest to become biconscious and make biconscious judgments in their divorce cases, or they will die. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, and e-textbook of 510 plus masculist